Muffins. The bullet left the rifle before anyone on that ridge had finished laughing. 1,400 meters downhill, in the flat white heat of a mountain valley that had been cooking since dawn, an enemy technical truck loaded with ammunition cases sat behind a low berm with its engine idling. The driver was leaning out the window. Two fighters crouched in the truck bed, scanning uphill with binoculars. Neither of them saw anything. Neither of them saw the woman lying flat in the dirt behind a suppressed bolt-action rifle, slowing her breathing, reading the shimmer of heat rising off the rocks, calculating what the wind was doing. 70 meters above the valley floor versus what it was doing at ground level, doing math in her head that most trained snipers would reach for a calculator to solve. The shot broke the silence like a door kicked off its hinges. The truck disappeared in a column of orange fire and black smoke so violent, it knocked the two fighters out of the bed before the sound even finished rolling across the ridge. The explosion echoed off the cliff faces in waves. Every Navy SEAL on that ridgeline went still, not from the blast, but from what they had just watched happen. Because the woman behind the rifle was 22 years old. She was wearing a medic's patch, and 40 minutes ago, Senior Chief Dex Harlan had told her to stay back because he didn't want a nurse slowing his team down. She had saved every single one of them, and not one of them had seen it coming. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a like on this video, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. Let's get into it. Mara Voss arrived at Blackridge Forward Operating Base on a Thursday morning in late July, which was the kind of morning where the heat was already doing serious damage by 8 p.m. And the mountains behind the base looked close enough to touch, but were far enough away that the distance made your eyes ache. She came in on the tail end of a logistics flight, seated between two crates of MREs and a field generator that smelled like burned rubber. She had a duffel bag, a hard case she carried herself and didn't let the crew chief touch, and a set of combat medic credentials that were 3 weeks old. She was the youngest person on the flight by at least 12 years. Blackridge Phobie was not a glamorous posting. It was a forward staging area carved out of a plateau in a region that had been contested for most of recorded history, operating under a joint mission structure that put Navy SEALs alongside attached Army personnel, intelligence assets, and a rotating cast of support staff. The SEALs ran the direct action missions. Everyone else existed to support that function, and the distinction between those two categories was not subtle. It was structural, cultural, and enforced with a kind of casual contempt that nobody had to announce, because it was simply in the air. Mara walked across the gravel yard toward the admin tent, carrying her own bags, and she got 3 different long looks from 3 different operators before she reached the door. And none of them were looks of welcome. The admin sergeant who processed her paperwork, a compact woman named Yolanda Reyes with short gray streaks in her hair, went through the standard intake questions with the efficient exhaustion of someone who had done this 600 times. Rank, specialty, emergency contacts, next of kin. Paused when she got to Mara's combat medic qualification. How old are you? Reyes asked. Not looking up 22, Mara said. Reyes looked up. She studied Mara's face for a moment, the way you study a weather report. You don't quite believe. Then she went back to the form. Your assignment is to the SEAL support element. You'll report to Senior Chief Harlan. He runs operations out of the main briefing structure, northeast corner of the compound. She paused again. It was not the kind of good luck that meant. She thought Mara would need it. It was the kind that meant she knew Mara was walking into something and wanted to be decent about it. Mara thanked her and went to find Senior Chief Harlan. She found him outside the briefing structure, standing in the shade of a canvas awning with 2 other operators, looking at a map laid out across a folding table. He was a broad, thick-shouldered man in his late 30s with a blunt, sun-darkened face, and the kind of stillness that came from a decade and a half of operating in places where fidgeting got people killed. He didn't look up when Mara stopped a few feet away. Senior Chief Harlan. Second Class Mara Voss, reporting for attachment to your element. Harlan looked up. He looked at her the way you look at a wrong item that arrived in the mail. Not angry, just confused about how it got there. Man. To his left, younger, around 30, with a jaw that looked like it had been designed by someone who took Jaws very seriously, let out a short, quiet sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in that neighborhood. His name, Mara would learn, was Petty Officer First Class Garrett Foss, and that sound was his version of a first impression. How long have you been in? Harlan asked. 14 months, Mara said. Ian. Harlan looked at the third man, a lean operator named Petty Officer Second Class Dario Ruiz, who said nothing but whose expression said enough. "Aye." Then Harlan looked back at Mara. "How old are you?" "22. "What's your combat deployment history?" "Aye. This is my first forward deployment." There was a silence that lasted about 4 seconds. Out on the gravel yard, someone dropped a toolbox and swore loudly. "Okay," Harlan said. He said it the way you say okay, when what you mean is this is a problem I now have to manage. "Drop your gear in the support tent. Us. We'll show you the layout. We'll figure out what to do with you." Back to his map. Mara picked up her duffel. A hard case. She kept close. She followed Voss toward the support tent without saying anything else. Voss walked with a loose athletic stride that communicated in every step that he had somewhere more important to be. He didn't speak for the first 30 meters. Then as they rounded the corner of the armory building, he glanced at the hard case in Mara's hand. "What's in the case?" "Medical equipment," she said. Looked at her. The case was not the shape of any medical equipment he had ever seen. It was long, narrow, and rigid, with double latches and a foam-padded interior. She clearly wasn't going to describe. "Right." He didn't push it right. He said medical equipment. The support tent was exactly what it sounded, a large canvas structure, housing the non-operator attached personnel with 6 cots, a folding table, 2 wall lockers, and a single oscillating fan that hadn't worked at full speed in 3 months. His cot was at the far end away from the entrance. She stowed her duffel under it and set the hard case on top, latched side up. She was still learning the compound layout when the first real problem started. It came in the form of Fosse, appearing at the tent entrance 2 hours later with a list of assignments Harlan had drawn up for her. She was to assist with wound supply inventory, maintain the medical station logs, and be available for medevac support if called. She was not assigned to any operational briefings, was not to be present during mission planning sessions, and was specifically excluded from the daily team range sessions, which was the time block every afternoon when the operators ran their shooting drills. She read list twice. Questions. Fosse said the range restriction, she said. "That's standard for attached personnel." "It's standard for people who aren't cleared for active mission role. I'm a combat medic. I'm weapons qualified. I'm attached to a combat element. Why would I be restricted from the range?" Voss smiled at her in a way that didn't involve any warmth. "Because Harlan runs a tight team and range time is operational. Your support personnel. That's not what my orders say. Orders put you at this phobie under Harlan's command authority. It decides the structure." He paused. "Look, I'm not trying to be the bad guy here. You're 22, you're a first deployment medic, and this is a SEAL forward operating element, running direct action missions in contested terrain. You're out of your depth. That's not an insult, it's just true. Do the job you're qualified to do, keep your head down, and you'll rotate out fine." Mara stood in the tent for a moment. The fan moved the hot air around. Outside, she could hear the distant crack of small arms from the range, the operators running their afternoon synthesizer, flat and sharp and rhythmic. She sat on her cot, opened her medical supply log, and started working. Argue. She did not push back. She did what she was told. For 3 days, she did exactly what she was told. She organized the medical station with an efficiency that Reyes, the admin sergeant, quietly noticed and said nothing about. She tracked supply levels, flagged a shortage in hemostatic gauze that had been overlooked for 2 weeks, and submitted a resupply request that was approved within 18 hours. She was available every time she was needed, which was not often a twisted ankle on day 2, a deep laceration on a piece of sheet metal on day 3. She treated both without being asked twice, and she did it without commentary. Also, watched. She was very good at watching. On the 4th day, the incident at the range happened. It started because Ruiz had left a piece of equipment in the medical tent and came to retrieve it during a window when he assumed the tent was empty. He found Mara sitting on her cot doing something with her hands that took him a moment to process. She had the hard case open across her lap, and she was running a cleaning rod through the barrel of a rifle that was not in any universe standard medical equipment. It was a bolt-action precision rifle, long matte-finish suppressor, threaded barrel adjustable stock, the kind of weapon that required a separate qualification, a separate skill set, and a level of operational commitment that did not come from being a 22-year-old first deployment medic on her first forward posting. Eyes stood in the tent entrance and stared at it. Mara looked up. She didn't rush to close the case. She finished the stroke of the cleaning rod, drew it back out, and set it across her knee. "You're going to tell Harlan," she said. It wasn't a question. Reyes said. "That's a MK-21 variant. It's mine," she said. "Personally owned, legally transported. My paperwork is in the top flap of the case if you want to see it. Why do you have a precision rifle? Because I shoot. 5. He looked at her for another moment, then he turned around and went to find Harlan. Conversation that followed Harlan in the tent doorway. Mara, standing beside the cot, the rifle back in its case but not hidden, was not shouting. Harlan wasn't a shouter. He was worse than a shouter. 5. He was a man who communicated disappointment and contempt through very measured, very calm sentences that left you with the impression you had failed some fundamental test of seriousness. Evans, you brought a personally owned precision rifle to a forward operating base, he said. What? Yes, Mara said, and your plan with it was what exactly? To be useful, she said. Voss was behind Harlan. He looked like someone trying not to laugh at a joke that wasn't quite funny. To play sniper, he said. I don't want to play anything, Mara said. Harlan studied her. Have you ever shot this weapon in a field condition under stress in actual operational context? Oh. She said, not in an operational context. I've shot it in training conditions. Harlan repeated. Where Montana? Private range. And a few weeks at a facility in Nevada. She hesitated, one small pause that lasted just long enough for everyone in the room to notice it. She said with an instructor. What instructor? 5. He's deceased, she said. He passed away 8 months ago. Harlan said nothing for a moment. The fan moved the air. Outside, someone's radio crackled. I want you to understand something, Harlan said. This is not a training environment. The people on this team have a combined 47 years of operational experience. What I need from you is wand management, medevac support, and medical oversight. What I don't need is a first deployment corpsman with a hobby rifle deciding she belongs on an overwatch position. Understand that. I understand your position, Mara said. That's not what I asked. I understand that you need me to do the medical job and stay in my lane, she said. I'll do that. Harlan nodded once. Good, keep the rifle in the case he left. Voss looked at her from the doorway for an extra moment. Montana, he said, private range. How long have you been shooting that rifle? Well, she said. He left too. 3 hours later, Mara was at the range. Not officially. Not with Harlan's permission. She had waited until the team's scheduled range block was finished, and the range itself was empty, which happened every evening around 6:30 when the lights started going orange and the operators cycled back for evening brief. She had talked to the range safety officer, a ranger corporal named Teddy Osman. No standing orders to exclude her, and who, after looking at her paperwork, her through with the weary indifference of someone who had stopped being surprised by things a long time ago. 5. She sat up at the 500-meter bench, and she moved to 700. Osman, who had settled in his chair with a paperback novel, looked up at the crack of the first shot. He watched her work through a 3-round group at 700 meters. Then she walked the bench to the 900-meter mark, reset, and shot again. He put the novel down. By the time she was shooting at 1100 meters, which was past where the standard range targets were posted, out into an improvised distance. She had set up with 2 empty cardboard boxes she'd found at the base perimeter. Osman had stood up from his chair and was watching with his arms folded. She was hitting the boxes, not every shot. 5. She missed at 1100 on her second attempt and made a small adjustment, a turn of the elevation dial, a shift of her body angle, and put the next 2 inside a radius that would have been respectable at half the distance. Osman said nothing. He picked up his radio, put it back down, picked up his novel, and failed to read it. 5. She shot for 40 minutes, packed the rifle into its case with the same deliberate care she had unpacked it with. Carried it back past Osman's chair. Good night, Corporal, she said. 5. Good night, he said. He was still looking at where the cardboard boxes had been. 5. She was almost to the range exit when she nearly walked into Fosse and Ruiz, who had come back for a piece of equipment. Fosse had left behind and had stopped at the range gate when they heard shots. Both of them were very still in the way that people go still when something has knocked loose an assumption they didn't know they were relying on. Fosse looked at the hard case in her hand. He looked at the range. Looked at Mara. Who authorized this? He said. I used the open range window, she said. Osman cleared me. You were shooting at what distance? I finished at 1100 and change, she said. Probably 1150. By my rough estimate, Fosse looked at Ruiz. Ruiz looked back at him with an expression that said he didn't have an explanation for this either. You want to come to the range tomorrow, Fosse said. It came out flat, like it wasn't a question. I was told I'm restricted from the range. I'm telling you to come to the range tomorrow. Does Harlan know that? Fosse said. He will. Mara looked at him for a moment. Time. 0600, she nodded, and walked past them toward the support tent. The next morning, the air was still cool enough to breathe properly, and the light was gray and clean on the mountains when Mara arrived at the range with her case. Lachlan was there. Fossey was there. Ruiz was there. And so was a fourth man. She hadn't met yet. A compact, angular operator named Petty Officer Second Class Levstrin, who had a reputation even among his teammates for being the team's best long-range shooter. Had a reputation for many things, but he wasn't an arrogant man about it. He was the kind of quiet that came from not needing to say much, and he looked at Mara and her case with a neutrality that was more respectful than anything the others had managed. Alan didn't greet her. He gestured toward the range bench. Osman told me what you were doing last night, he said. I want to see it in the light with people watching. All right, she said. Strand's going to shoot with you. Targets, same distances, she nodded. Strand looked at her rifle when she assembled it. He said nothing, but he looked at the scope, stock settings, the suppressor, and he set up his own rifle beside hers with the careful attention of someone taking a situation seriously. They started at 600 meters, both hit clean. 700. Both hit clean. 800. Strand adjusted twice, Mara adjusted once. At 1,000 meters. Strand's group was tight and excellent, 3 rounds in a spread that most operators would consider outstanding. Second's group was inside his. Not by much, 2 centimeters, maybe 3. Inside, nobody said anything. At 1,200 meters, Fossey stopped pretending to look elsewhere. Had his arms folded and had stopped checking his watch. Even Harlan was no longer studying the logbook he'd been holding. Pulled her second round wide at 1,200, a genuine miss, the bullet pulling right in a gust that shifted at the worst possible second, and she marked the position in her small notebook, and put the next 2 where she wanted them. Mind fired his group. He glanced at her target. He looked forward again. Mind moved, he said. It wasn't defensive, it was an observation. Minds. She nodded. It dropped about 3 knots and changed direction about 15 degrees at the transition point past the berm, she said. I was late catching it on the second round. Strand looked at her directly for the first time. How do you read the mirage off this terrain? Heat shimmer off the rock face to the northwest gives you early warning. It changes angle before the wind actually shifts. You can usually get about 2 seconds of read if you're watching the right spot. Strand was quiet for a moment. Then he said, who taught you that? There was a small silence that had a specific texture to it. Not uncomfortable exactly, but careful. She was choosing her footing on ground she knew had soft spots. Someone who spent a lot of time in these kinds of environments, she said. An nodded. He didn't push. Harlan, who had watched this entire exchange from behind them, closed his logbook. He walked forward to look at Mara's targets himself, walking the length of the range to the 1,200-meter mark, which he didn't usually do. He stood there for a moment, then walked back. Where'd you learn to read wind like that? He asked. Montana, she said. Long practice. He studied her. Who was your instructor? She said. He passed last year. Alan said nothing for a moment. The morning was warming up. Have any formal military sniper training? No, she said. Everything you know you learned outside the system. Yes. He looked at her rifle, then at the target frames downrange. Asked, keep the range window you used last night, he said. 6:30 when the team's finished. Osman will know you're cleared. He paused. You stay in the medical role. That doesn't change. But if I'm going to have someone on this element who can actually shoot, I want them sharp. Walked away. Fossey looked at Mara with an expression that had finally reluctantly let go of its original shape. He said. He meant it as a test. Maybe, she said. He almost smiled, not quite. The shift in how she was treated was not dramatic. It wasn't a sudden wave of respect or a formal acknowledgement that she had earned her place. It was more like a temperature change, gradual and uneven, with some rooms still cold. Stopped assigning her the worst supply duties without explanation. Started saying good morning. Strand, who didn't say much to anyone, occasionally sat near her at meals without it being an accident. Island remained professionally distant. He needed her in the medical role, and he was willing to acknowledge what she could do with a rifle, but she understood he was not going to let those two facts get confused with each other. She was still the attached medic. She was still the youngest person on the compound. She was still in his operational framework, not an operator. That understanding held for 2 weeks. Then the patrol into the valley changed everything. The mission briefing happened on a Tuesday evening. The objective was a compound 6 kilometers into the mountain terrain to the northeast, where intelligence suggested a mid-level logistics coordinator for an active insurgent network was sheltering. And was a small element Harlan II attached, Army Rangers named Becker and Noah Ellison moving in before dawn. establishing a perimeter, making the grab, and exiting before the compound's protection detail could organize a response. Mara was not in the briefing. She was in the medical tent, logging supplies, and doing the kind of routine work that had become her entire visible purpose at Black Ridge. Strand appeared at the tent entrance 20 minutes after the brief ended. He stood there for a moment. "Harlan wants you read in," he said. She looked up on tomorrow's mission, he said. "He's putting you on overwatch." She set down her pen. "Why the change?" "Because Osmond told him what you did at the range last night," Strand said. 1,500-meter cold-bore wind conditions, first round clean. Osmond's been running ranges for 9 years, and he said he's never seen anyone do it. He paused. "Also, Harlan doesn't have a dedicated Overwatch asset on this element, and the intel package suggests the extraction corridor might need one." Aya looked at the supply log in front of her. "What's the Overwatch position?" "High ground, 600 meters north of the compound. I have eyes on the main approach, the entry point, and the extraction route. If things go wrong, you hold the corridor open. Medic duties. Times. Still yours. If anyone goes down, you come off the position." "That's the agreement." She looked at him for another moment. "And Harlan's comfortable." "With this, comfortable is a strong word," Strand said. "He thinks you can do the job. He doesn't think anything went wrong while you're on the position." A small pause. "He said to tell you it's your call." She stood up. "When do we brief the position detail?" 20 minutes, Strand said. "Main structure." The briefing was businesslike and without ceremony. Island covered the ground layout, the approach corridors, the contingency routes. When he got to the Overwatch position, he spoke to Mara directly and without condescension, which was the first time he'd done that, and which meant more than he probably intended. Voss said nothing during the brief that was directed at her. Eyes and Becker were focused on their own roles. Ellison, the female ranger, who had a quiet, watchful quality similar to Mara's own, caught Mara's eye once across the table and gave her a single nod that communicated something in the compressed language of women who have learned to calibrate how much space they take up. The team moved out at 0300. The insertion route took them up a dry stream, then through a long traverse of broken rock and loose shale that required careful footing in the dark. Aya moved second from last in the column, with Strand ahead of her and Ruiz behind. She carried her rifle and her full medical kit, and she did not struggle with either, which Ruiz behind her could not help but notice because he had expected her to. The Overwatch position was a shelf of rock at the top of a ridgeline, offering a clean line of sight down to the compound and across the two main approach corridors. Mara arrived at the position 10 minutes before the team was in place at the compound perimeter. She settled in without a tripod. She hadn't brought one, which Strand noted and filed away without saying anything about, and ranged the compound entrance, the two corner positions, and the main road junction 400 meters beyond. She was marking her range card when something caught her attention. The road below, leading to the compound's main gate from the north, had a stretch of loose gravel that she'd noticed in the satellite imagery during the brief. She was looking at that stretch now through her scope in the early gray light before dawn, and something was wrong with it. The gravel pattern was disrupted. It wasn't obvious. You'd have to be looking for it, or you'd have to be the kind of person who had spent years reading terrain the way other people read text, and Mara was that kind of person. But the disturbed earth had a geometry that wasn't natural. It was a rectangle, two rectangles actually, offset from each other, and covered with fresh gravel raked over the top. She keyed her radio lead element. "This is Overwatch. Position. I have a possible buried obstacle on the primary approach north side, approximately 20 meters before the gate." Island's voice came back flat and controlled, defined possible. Disturbed earth pattern. Two rectangular impressions covered gravel. Within the last 12 hours based on the texture. A 4-second silence, alternate approach. East side of the compound, the irrigation ditch. Longer approach. But the ground is unworked. Other silence. Mara could hear very faintly through the radio Harlan talking to Fossey, watching to alternate. Harlan said all elements confirm. Element moved. It took 11 additional minutes, and it required Becker to cross a section of open ground that he didn't like crossing, but they reached the compound perimeter from the east and made entry without incident. 40 minutes later, when they came out with the target detail in flex cuffs on the ground, Ruiz walked close to the buried markers on the north road out of professional curiosity and found two IED devices, pressure plate, triggered position to catch the entire team if they'd come in from that direction. He looked up at the ridgeline where Mara's position was. He couldn't see her from down there. She was good at not being seen. Overwatch. he said quietly into his radio. North approach confirmed. Places. He paused. Good read. Mara said nothing. Hi. She was already scanning the extraction corridor, watching the road, watching the far tree line, watching the mountain face to the west where the light was finally starting to come up orange over the ridgeline. The extraction went smoothly for the first 4 kilometers. And the vehicles appeared. They came from the south, 2 trucks, moving fast, headlights still on in the early dawn. The first truck was a pickup with armed men in the bed. The second was a technical, a larger vehicle with a mounted weapon system in the back, and it was moving with the kind of urgency that meant someone had been watching and had called ahead. Ellen's voice on the radio was very calm. Overwatch, we have 2 vehicles approaching from the south, back in distance. Mara was already on them. Lead vehicle is 800 meters in closing. Technical is 600 meters behind him. They're going to be on your position in under 3 minutes. She had done the math already. Vehicle would be within effective range in 40 seconds. The technical was the real problem. The mounted weapon system could reach the team's current position and had the angle to cover the extraction route. If the technical got to the junction point, they were trapped. I can take the lead vehicle, she said. But the technical has to go first. It's the threat. Can you make the technical? She looked at the second truck through her scope. 100 meters. The road was dropping into a slight downgrade, which would push the impact point low. The heat was already starting to build mirage. The wind at her position was a slight quartering crosswind, but she didn't know what it was doing at valley floor elevation. Give me a go, she said. 1 second. Take the shot, Harlan said. Settled the crosshairs. She breathed in, halfway out, held. She calculated the wind layer below her from the mirage shimmer off the valley road surface. She added 4 minutes of elevation and held off the windward edge of the target. The technical's cab was in her reticle, but the cab wasn't the shot she wanted. Truck bed. Behind the cab was loaded. She could see the silhouette of stacked cases against the dawn sky. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle moved. The suppressor absorbed most of the signature. She was already working the bolt when the bullet was still in flight. 1,400 meters of flight time, traveling at close to the speed of sound at altitude, hopping through the morning air on a trajectory. She had calculated in her head in under 20 seconds. A truck bed exploded, not a small detonation. A cascading chain of secondary explosions. As the ammunition cooked off one after another, the technical lifting onto its front wheels, and then folding sideways in a column of fire that rolled up into the gray morning sky and kept going. Last wave. Reached her position 3 seconds later. Stopped. The concussion pressed against her cheek. The lead vehicle stopped. The men in the bed were looking back at where the technical had been. Maya was already on the lead vehicle. She put 2 rounds through the engine block from 800 meters. The truck slid sideways across the road and stalled. "And is clear," she said into the radio. "You have a window." Move now. The team moved. She held the position for another 4 minutes, watching the road, watching the men from the lead truck, who had abandoned their vehicle and were moving on foot away from the extraction route and not toward it. When the last element crossed the safe point on the extraction corridor, she broke down from her position, packed the rifle, and began moving to the pickup point. She arrived 2 minutes before the helicopter. Nobody on the team said anything to her immediately. There was the controlled chaos of loading, of securing the target and the wounded Ranger Ellison, who had taken a fragment in her left shoulder during the compound breach, a wound Mara treated in the back of the helicopter with the same methodical efficiency. She brought to everything in the noise and vibration of the aircraft, with her hands steady and her focus complete. When the helicopter touched down back at Black Ridge and the rotors were spooling down, Voss climbed out ahead of her, and then turned and stood there for a moment, with an expression that had finally fully let go of everything it had been holding. "That was a 1,400-meter shot," he said. "Unfamiliar position, improvised range card." "To 1450, she said. "The truck was still closing when I fired." He stood there. He was working on something. She could see it. He said. But it came out different this time. It came out like he was finally admitting. It didn't mean what he'd meant it to mean. I looked at him. "That wasn't the first time you've made a shot like that," Fosse said. It wasn't quite a question. She held the rifle case with both hands. The morning was already hot. Behind them, the medical team was moving Ellison to the clinic, and Harlan was on his radio, and the compound was doing the loud, busy thing it always did after a mission came back. She thought about Montana. She thought about a man in his late 60s with weathered hands and a habit of going quiet for so long you forgot he was there, lying prone on a ridge above a river valley with the afternoon light making the grass shimmer. and saying to her without urgency, read the wind first. Read it before you touch the rifle. The rifle only does what you tell it. Mind. The wind does what it wants. Learn to want the same thing it wants. Oh, she said. It wasn't. Lee looked at her for another moment. Got you. She looked out at the mountains. Lied. Someone who deserved a better student, she said. Life. She walked toward the medical tent, and Fossey stood where he was, and the morning kept getting hotter, and somewhere in the mountains to the northeast, a column of black smoke was still rising from where an ammunition truck had been, marking the spot like a finger pointing at the sky, and every operator on Black Ridge who saw it knew something had shifted and wasn't going back to the way it was before. Jacqueline was standing near the briefing structure when Mara passed. Upper. He watched her go, then he went back inside. But she heard him say one thing quietly to Strand, who was standing beside him. Find out who her instructor was. Harlan said everything. Find. Said I already started. And what they were going to find was going to change everything she had carefully avoided telling them, because the man who taught her was not just gone. He was the reason she was here at this FOB with this rifle, doing exactly this work, and his name was going to mean something to people who had spent their careers in rooms where that name came up only in past tense, only with a specific kind of reverence reserved for people who rewrote what was thought possible. Her grandfather had trained her for 3 years and then died before he could see what she'd become. And she had promised him she would never use what he taught her to become something she wasn't. She wasn't sure, standing in the heat of Blackridge FOB with a rifle case in her hands and smoke still on the horizon, whether she was keeping that promise or breaking it. She wasn't sure he would know either. That thought sat with her for the next 4 days. Like a stone, she kept reaching into her pocket to find. The base returned to its rhythms after the mission. The morning briefs, the equipment checks, the range sessions, the long afternoons of waiting that were their own kind of operational stress. But the rhythms were slightly different now, in the specific way that things shift after a shared experience, redraws the map of who people think they're dealing with. Started including her in the informal post-mission reviews that happened over bad coffee in the armory. Showed her a range card system he'd developed for mountain environments, unprompted. The way you share a tool with someone you've decided is going to use it correctly. Even Becker, who was Army and had his own set of tribal loyalties, acknowledged her in the mess hall with the specific nod that operators reserve for people who have demonstrated something real. This was more complicated. He didn't apologize. He wasn't built for apologies in any clean or direct sense, and Mara didn't want one exactly. He stopped with the small, careless dismissals, the slight emphasis on support personnel, the way he used to hand her supply manifests to review like they were beneath him to touch. He treated her now with a watchful, somewhat grudging attention. The way you treat someone you've concluded is probably better at one specific thing than you are, and you're still working out what to do with that conclusion. Ellen had said nothing to her directly since the mission. Not about the shot. Not about what Strand was looking into. Not about any of it. He ran his briefs, he ran his team, and he looked at Mara when she was in the room the way you look at a variable you're still calculating. On the 5th day, Strand found her at the evening range session. She was at the 900-meter mark working through a cold bore sequence. She ran at the start of every session. First shot always told you something, and she liked to know it before she needed to know it under pressure. She heard him come up behind her and waited until she'd completed the shot before she turned. He sat down on the bench beside her position without asking permission, which meant he'd decided something. Almost Voss, he said. The name hit her like a change in air pressure. She didn't let anything show on her face, but her hand stilled on the rifle stock for exactly 1 second too long. Hey, where did you find that? She said. Army records. His service jacket was declassified 2 years ago. Strand looked out at the range. Nice. He's in the record books for 3 confirmed engagements during his service that I'm not going to describe, because the distances involved would sound like I was making them up. He developed a wind-reading methodology that's been cited in 2 military marksmanship papers under a pseudonym because the original attribution was sealed. He paused. He was your grandfather. It wasn't a question. Yes, she said. And he trained you for 3 years, she said. Every summer. Starting when I was 17, Strand was quiet for a moment. A sound of wind moved through the range, lifting a small curl of dust off the berm. Didn't you disclose the training? Because it wasn't military training, she said. There's no form, for my grandfather was a legendary Marine sniper, and I spent 3 years on a Montana hillside learning everything he knew. It didn't fit any category I was supposed to declare. And looked at her. Harlan's going to want to know. He's going to be angry you held it back. I know that too. Are you worried about it? She considered the question honestly. I'm worried about what he does with it, she said. Not about him being angry. Strand picked up a small piece of gravel from the bench and turned it over in his fingers. Mara Voss's methodology. The wind reading, the way you calculate the intermediate layer between your position and the target, that's what you're doing, isn't it? That's not something you developed yourself. Taught me, she said. I've added to it. Refined it for the terrain types I've been shooting in. Right. But the foundation is his. That foundation is better than anything we teach in formal training, Strand said. Right. He set the gravel piece down. I want you to know that I'm saying that without a qualification attached to it. Looked at him. Thank you, she said. I'm going to tell Harlan tonight, he said. The name. About what I found. I thought you should know before I did. She nodded, tell him. He got up and walked back toward the main compound without another word. She turned back to the range, loaded a fresh round, and shot. The conversation with Harlan happened 2 hours later, and it was nothing like she expected, which was to say it was worse and more measured and more unsettling than outright anger would have been. Harlan sat across from her in the small briefing room, with the door closed and a folder on the table between them, and he worked through what Strand had given him with a systematic thoroughness that left her nowhere to hide. Mara Voss, he said, not looking up from the folder. Maternal grandfather Marine Scout sniper, 2 tours in contested theaters, 3 confirmed long-range engagements that are still in the training literature under sanitized citations. Tired, with a chest full of decorations he never talked about publicly. 8 months ago in Ravalli County, Montana, he looked up. You trained under him for 3 years, she said. And when you applied for your combat medic position and your deployment assignment, you disclosed none of this. There was no field to disclose it in, she said. Informal civilian training with a family member who happens to be a veteran isn't a category on any form I filled out. Don't play paperwork games with me, Harlan said, and it was the sharpest thing he'd said to her in the whole conversation. You knew what you had, you knew it was significant. Not to surface it. She held his gaze. If I had walked into a recruiting office and said my grandfather was a decorated Marine sniper and he trained me for 3 years in the Montana backcountry, they would have either laughed at me or put me in the wrong box. A 22-year-old with informal family training and no military marksmanship record on paper goes into the category of delusional before she goes into the category of asset. You know that's true. Harlan said nothing for a moment. The air conditioning unit in the corner was making a grinding sound it hadn't been making last week. So you decided to come out here and demonstrate it instead, he said. He said, that's not how this works, I know. I have to report this to command, he said. The undisclosed training background changes your profile. There will be a review depending on how they look at it. There could be grounds for a discharge action. The word landed in the room with a specific weight. I understand. Did you? Yes, she said. I made a calculation. I decided that getting here and doing the job was more important than the risk of not getting here at all. That's the honest answer. Harlan looked at her for a long time. The folder was still open in front of him. She could see the edge of a printed photograph, her grandfather in his service portrait, younger than she'd ever known him, with a face that looked like hers in a way that still caught her off guard when she saw it. Grandfather, he said, was he worth it? The question surprised her, not its meaning but its texture. It wasn't what she'd expected from Harlan, who dealt in logistics and probabilities, not in the emotional architecture of why people did things. He was the best person I ever knew, she said, and he would have hated me saying that because he spent most of his life convinced he'd done more damage than good. Harlan looked at the photograph for a moment, then he closed the folder. I'll submit to the disclosure report tonight, he said. Fine. Command will decide what they do with it. In the meantime, you stay in your role and you do your job. All right, she said, and Voss, she stopped at the door. The technical the IED read on the approach road. Those are in my after-action report with your name attached. He looked at her steadily. That's also going to command. She held the door. Things at once, she said. That's how it usually works, he said. The review process moved with the slow, grinding indifference of any military administrative procedure, which meant it moved fast enough to generate anxiety and slow enough to do nothing about it. Mara received a formal notification of review 3 days after Harlan submitted the disclosure report. She was instructed to remain available, continue her duties, and refrain from participating in operational missions pending resolution. That last part was the one that cut. She went back to the medical tent, to supply logs and wound management and medevac readiness, back to being the attached medic in the support tent, while the team ran their briefs and planned their missions without her in the room. Voss, to his credit, didn't make anything of it. Ruiz and Becker said nothing. And stopped by the medical tent once and sat for a while not saying much, which was how he expressed things that didn't have good words. It was Fossey who told her on the 7th day of the review period that there was a new mission being planned. He appeared in the tent doorway in the early evening, with his hands in his pockets, which she'd learned meant he was deciding how to say something. Putting together a package for a hostage recovery operation, he said. Comfortable. Is in the mix. He's going in as the assault element lead. There's a compound in the Eastern Valley about 11 kilometers out. She looked up from her log and in command sent an intelligence officer down from the regional cell to run the targeting package. He paused. His name is Halden Grant Halden. He's been running analysis on the network we hit last week, and apparently the hostage is connected to that network. How? The hostage is a local interpreter who worked with the provincial council. Grabbed 4 days ago. The network took him as a message. Voss came a few more steps into the tent. Wants a clean strike package. He's pushing for Overwatch support with authority to take the target commander if the opportunity presents. She was quiet for a moment, and this involves me. Because Harlan told Halden about you, Fossey said. And Halden wants to meet with you before he'll approve the Overwatch component. The meeting happened the following morning in the main briefing structure. Halden was a man in his mid-40s who had the bearing of someone who had spent his career in rooms where information was power and had organized his entire personality around that fact. He was trim, carefully put together with the kind of controlled effect that intelligence officers developed when they'd spent enough years reading situations for advantage. He had a manila folder on the table. Everyone around here seemed to arrive with folders, and he'd already read it before she walked in. Voss, he said. Not a greeting, exactly. Judgment. Mr. Halden. Sit down, she sat. Looked at her. The way he probably looked at most things, assessing, categorizing, deciding. I've reviewed your disclosure documentation and Harlan's after-action reports. You have an unusual skill profile, I've been told that, she said. I'm going to be direct with you, he said, which in Mara's experience meant he was going to be a specific kind of indirect. Operation has a hostage component and a targeting component. Hostage is priority, but the network commander who ordered the grab is a secondary objective. If the opportunity presents during the extraction, I want that shot taken. Understand the mission structure, she said. The Overwatch position will have line of sight to both the hostage extraction corridor and the commander's likely position. He tapped the folder. I want someone on that position who can make a decision quickly and execute it cleanly. Kind of decision, she said. The kind where a target is in your reticle and you fire. She looked at him steadily. The decision to fire is always conditional, she said. Natural civilian presence, ROE. I'll make the shot if the conditions are met. Acton's expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted slightly. The way a door shifts in its frame when the wind changes outside. Conditions will be met, he said. That's what the targeting package is designed to ensure. Targeting packages don't always survive contact with the ground, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Harlan, who was standing to the side of the table with his arms folded and the expression of a man watching a chess game he didn't set up. She'll be on the position, Halden said to Harlan. Make sure she understands the secondary objectives is not discretionary if the shot is clean. He picked up his folder and left. Harlan looked at Mara after the door closed. He runs the targeting, Harlan said. We run the operation. I know the difference, she said. Good. He pushed a copy of the mission brief across the table. We move in 48 hours. The mission prep moved fast. Aya worked through her Overwatch position planning with Strand, who shared the load without being asked, pulling elevation data and range estimates for the Eastern Valley compound with the methodical competence that made him easy to work with. And the ranger element, including Staff Sergeant Lucas Bell, who had a wide, feathered face, and the kind of low-key confidence that came from doing dangerous things long enough to get bored by the fear, ran their breach rehearsals in the compound yard until they had it down to a tempo they liked. The night before the mission, Mara sat alone at the evening range session and shot nothing. She just lay in the prone position with her rifle unpacked, looking through the scope at the empty target frames in the last of the evening light, thinking about something her grandfather had said once, toward the end of the third summer. And they were lying on a ridge above a dry riverbed, and she'd asked him why he'd left the Marines when he still had years of service ahead of him. He'd been quiet for so long, she thought he wasn't going to answer. 'Cause I got very good at it," he'd finally said. And being very good at it was making me into someone I didn't want to be. She put the scope cap back on, she packed the rifle and walked back to the compound. The team inserted at 0200 cold dark mountain terrain, eating the sound of their movement in the way it always did out here. Moved to the overwatch position, which this time was a longer approach, a traverse of broken rocky ground that took 40 minutes and left her with a scrape on her left forearm from a fall. She caught, before it became slow, not before it drew blood through her sleeve. She settled into position and ranged the compound, 40 meters, to the hostage building. Her intelligence set a low stone structure at the southeast corner of the compound where the interpreter was being held. The commander's likely position was the main structure at the northwest, approximately 230 meters from the hostage building, and he was expected to show himself at the interior courtyard entrance during any breach response. She marked her range card. She waited. The breach went wrong in the first 40 seconds. Not catastrophically, but the compound had more people in it than the intelligence package suggested. And when Becker's element went through the east gate, they hit resistance from 3 separate positions instead of 1, which meant the assault element was immediately in a 3-way suppression fight instead of a clean corridor run. Bell's ranger team pushed toward the hostage building, but took fire from a second-floor position that hadn't shown up in the imagery. Mara picked off the second-floor shooter before anyone had to ask. 800 meters moving target in a window opening 1 round. The window went dark. Second floor is clear, she said on the radio. The team reached the hostage building. She heard the breach charge small controlled, then Bell's voice confirming contact with the interpreter, alive, mobile, scared, but functional. Then she saw the commander. He appeared exactly where the intelligence said he would, the courtyard entrance of the northwest structure, 40 meters from the wall in a clear line of sight from her position. Athens. He was talking into a radio, and he was the man Halden's package had identified, and she had him in her reticle at a range that required no unusual calculation. She put the crosshairs on him, and then in the 3 seconds before she would have fired, 3 children came through the gate at the south end of the courtyard. They were running not toward the commander, running away from the noise of the breach, the way children run when the world becomes suddenly, incomprehensibly violent. They were between 7 and 12 years old, and they were crossing the open courtyard in a diagonal that placed them directly in the shot's exit path, behind the target kill zone. She would be firing into. The commander was still in her reticle. The shot was there. If he moved 2 steps left, the children would be clear. If she waited for him to move, she might lose him. She had a window measured in seconds. Halden's voice came through on the command channel, clipped and hard. Overwatch. Target is in the open. Do you have the shot? She watched the children. She watched the commander. Watched. The geometry of it negative, she said. I have 3 juveniles in the line. Can you wait for a clean window? He's moving, she said. He's going back inside. I have about 4 seconds. Take it before he clears. She held the rifle. She watched the crosshairs sit on the commander's center mass, the children behind him, the courtyard wall beyond them. She took her finger off the trigger. Negative, she said. Fine. In the line, shot is not clean. The commander went back through the doorway and disappeared into the structure. The silence on the command channel lasted about 2 seconds. Then Halden's voice came back, and it was a different temperature than before. Overwatch, he said. Confirm you just declined a direct targeting instruction. She was already scanning the perimeter, watching the extraction route, working the job she was still doing, even while the argument was forming around her. Confirm. I declined a shot with civilian children in the line of fire, she said. That's not a targeting instruction. That's an ROE violation. There's silence. Bell's voice cut across the channel. Hostage is secured, moving to extraction. Requesting overwatch coverage on the north gate. Off gate. I have you, Mara said. And she moved her scope. She covered the extraction. She held the corridor open, tracked 2 fighters moving to cut off Bell's element, put both down at range before they could close the distance. She did the job through to the end of the mission. When the last element crossed the extraction point and the compound was behind them, and the hostage interpreter was in the helicopter wrapped in a thermal blanket with his hand shaking. But Halden was already on the phone before they landed. And when the team came off the helicopter at Blackridge, the base commander was waiting at the pad, which was not something that happened after routine missions, and next to him stood a man in clean clothes who had the composed, purposeful look of someone who had been building a case. Voss stepped close to Mara as they walked off the pad, close enough to speak under the rotor noise. Ian got on the line before we were wheels up, Fossey said quietly. He's filing an insubordination report. He paused. He's saying you let the commander walk because you couldn't handle the pressure. I looked at the base commander and the man in clean clothes waiting at the edge of the pad. Wrong, she said. I know he is, Fossey said. And it was the clearest thing, the most direct thing he had ever said to her, and there was no hesitation in it at all. But the man in the clean clothes was already moving toward her, and behind him the base commander had the expression of someone managing a problem he hadn't wanted on his desk. And Mara kept walking forward because there was nothing else to do. And she could see in the way the situation was assembling itself around her that whatever came next was going to be the hardest part of all of it, harder than the shot, harder than the review, harder than lying on a cold ridgeline in the dark, waiting for a mission to go wrong. Because this time the weapon pointed at her wasn't a rifle. Because this time the weapon pointed at her wasn't a rifle. The man in the clean clothes introduced himself as Major Philip Drent, Regional Command Inspector General's office. And he did it with the practiced politeness of someone who had learned that being pleasant in the first 30 seconds made the next several hours easier to manage. He had a tablet under one arm and a recorder in his breast pocket, and he shook Mara's hand with the firm, neutral grip of a man conducting an administrative process, not a conversation. Voss, he said, I'd like a few minutes when you're ready. I need to finish post-mission medical checks first, she said. He looked at the base commander, Colonel Avery Sims, a tall man with gray at his temples who had the look of someone who had been pulled into this situation sideways and was now responsible for its outcome. Sims gave a small nod. Drent stepped back. She spent 20 minutes in the medical bay working through the team. Had a friction burn on his right hand from a rope traverse. Had taken a ricochet fragment in the upper left arm, small, shallow, not arterial, but it needed cleaning and closure. Ranger, a young private named Okafor, had a partial hearing loss in his left ear from the breech charge proximity. She documented everything, treated everything, and when she was done she washed her hands at the sink and stood there for a moment, looking at the water going down the drain. Then she went to find Drent. He had set up in the small side office adjacent to the briefing structure, a room barely large enough for 2 chairs and a table which she suspected was chosen deliberately. All rooms created the impression of a closed world. She sat down. He set the recorder on the table between them with a small click. This is a preliminary inquiry, he said, not a formal hearing. You're not required to have representation present, but you can request it. I don't need representation, she said. I'll tell you what happened. Good. He opened the tablet. During tonight's operation, you were designated as Overwatch element with secondary targeting authority on a named individual identified in the mission package. At approximately 0347, you had line of sight on that individual and were instructed by the operational intelligence officer to take the shot. Walk me through your decision. She had thought about how to say this on the helicopter ride back, to make it sound better than it was. The decision hadn't been complicated, but explaining it to someone who hadn't been on the ridge was always going to require translation. The target was in my reticle, she said. It was at a range and position consistent with a clean shot under normal conditions. But there were 3 civilian children in the courtyard. They were moving. Their path put them in the direct exit line of the shot behind the target inside the impact zone, within the fragmentation radius of a high-velocity round at that distance. I had approximately 4 seconds before the target moved to cover. And in those 4 seconds you determined that the shot was not clean. Intelligence Officer Halden's assessment is that a 2-step lateral movement by the target would have cleared the children from the line. Officers. Halden was not on the ridge, she said. He was watching a drone feed with a 20-degree overhead angle. Position at scope level horizontal plane. The children's path and the target's position were overlapping. A 2-step lateral movement by the target would have required me to predict which direction he would move and pre-adjust. I had 4 seconds and no way to predict movement. I fired, and he moved the wrong direction. One of those children was in the round's path. Drent made a note. The target subsequently returned to cover and has not been reacquired. I'm aware of that. Halden has formally characterized your decision as an emotional response under pressure rather than a tactical judgment. He's recommending your removal from operational roles and a review of your overall deployment status. She looked at the recorder. She looked at Drent. That's Halden's characterization, she said. I've given you mine. Can you speak to the difference? As an emotional response would have been paralysis, she said. I made a calculation under time pressure using the information I had from my actual position. I made the same kind of calculation I made when I read the approach road before the first mission, when I identified the IED positioning from disturbed gravel patterns and redirected the element to the alternate route. That decision was also mine alone, under time pressure, without confirmation from anyone else. Auckland's after-action documents it as correct. She paused. If the first call was tactical judgment, so was the second one. The only difference is that this time the calculation produced an outcome. Halden didn't want. Drent wrote something. The recorder sat between them, its small light steady. Is there anything else you'd like to add to the preliminary record, he said. Yes, she said, the shot I didn't take was the right call. I would make it again. He looked up at her then, and for the first time something human moved through his professional composure. Not agreement, not disagreement, just a genuine moment of attention. A man behind the process, registering that the person across the table was not equivocating. Understood, he said. He reached over and clicked off the recorder. Halden's report moved through the system faster than the review of her undisclosed training background had, which told Mara something about how much institutional weight the intelligence officer carried. Within 36 hours of the mission, she had received a second formal notification, this one, a restriction from all operational planning involvement pending the outcome of a combined review of both matters. Undisclosed training. The declined shot packaged together by someone who understood how to use administrative process as a weapon. She was back to the medical tent, back to supply log. She sat on her cot the night after the second notification arrived and held the small notebook she used for range cards, not reading it, just holding it. The tent's single working lamp threw a yellow circle on the canvas wall. She could hear Fossey and Ruiz talking somewhere outside, low voices, nothing she could make out. The base was doing its nighttime sounds generators, distant rotors from a resupply flight, the occasional cough of someone in the next tent over, and appeared in the doorway. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and he looked at her with the steady, unsurprised attention he brought to most things. Halden's been on the command channel most of today, he said. He's pushing hard, I know, she said. Harlan filed a counterstatement this afternoon, Strand said. I don't know everything that's in it, but Ruiz told me. Harlan spent 2 hours writing it. Looked at him. Harlan writing a 2-hour statement was not a small thing. Harlan was not a man who spent 2 hours doing anything that wasn't essential. Filed 1 too. Strand said, the ranger. He was there. He saw what you did on the corridor after you declined the shot. The 2 fighters you dropped before they could cut off his element. He paused. He says that without those 2 shots, he and the interpreter might not have made it to the extraction point. She thought about Bell's team moving through the narrow lane between the compound walls, the interpreter stumbling Bell's hand on his arm, pulling him forward, and the 2 fighters she'd seen coming around the north end of the compound wall at a run. She'd had 3 seconds to decide which one to shoot first, and she'd taken the one on the right because he had a better angle on Bell's position, and then shifted left for the second round before the first fighter had finished falling. She hadn't thought about it in those terms at the time. She'd just done it. Halden's argument won't hold, Strand said. Reassurance. Just his read of the situation stated plainly. You can't call it emotional paralysis when the same decision-maker put 2 rounds on 2 moving targets at range inside the same 6-minute window. We'll find a way to frame it, she said. Maybe, Strand said. But Harlan will find a way to unframe it. He paused again. You should sleep whatever comes next. You'll need to be sharp for it. She turned off the lamp. She didn't sleep well. She lay in the dark and listened to the bass, and thought about her grandfather, sitting on the porch of the ranch house in the late summer evening, a glass of water on the rail, because he'd stopped drinking anything stronger years before she was born. Telling her something she hadn't fully understood at the time. The hardest shot you'll ever make isn't the one at distance. It's the one you could make and choose not to. Anyone can pull a trigger. The question is whether you know when not to. She had known. Standing on that ridge with 3 children in her shot's path and a clock running, she had known with absolute clarity, the way you know things that live below argument. She still wasn't sure it was going to save her. The combined review convened 4 days later, and it was not in a small office. It was in the main briefing structure with the 3 officer panels assembled via secure video link to the regional command, plus Drent in the room as the IG representative, plus Helton seated to one side with a folder thick enough to function as a doorstop, plus Harlan seated across from him with a much thinner folder and a stillness that filled the room more effectively than the stack of paper. Sat at the center table. She had her own documentation arrange cards, her after-action accounts written in her own hand, and one additional item that she had spent the night before the review preparing a written technical analysis of the shot she had declined to take, including the precise angular geometry of her position relative to the target and the children, the wind and ballistic variables, and a calculation of the fragmentation radius of a high-velocity round at that range. She had done the math 3 times to make sure it was right. It was the kind of document that took a skilled marksman to write and a skilled marksman to read, and she had gambled that at least one person in the room would be able to do both. Opened with a 20-minute presentation that was well constructed and deeply unfair, in the way that presentations built entirely from true facts arranged in a misleading order could be. He walked through her undisclosed training background, as though it were a pattern of deliberate deception. He walked through the decline shot as the culminating exhibit in a case for instability under operational pressure. He used the phrase too emotionally invested twice. He used the phrase demonstrated poor judgment once. She watched the 3 officers on the video panel while he talked. 2 of them were unreadable. The third, a colonel with short gray hair named Whitmore, was taking notes with a pen on paper old school, and his pen had stopped moving about 6 minutes into Halden's presentation. That was either very good or very bad. Then it was Harlan's turn. He stood up and opened the thin folder and said, "Without preamble, Cormans has participated in 2 operational missions under my command." In the first, she identified an IED positioning on the primary approach route through direct visual analysis of disturbed terrain and redirected the element, preventing what would have been a double device detonation in the middle of the team's movement. In the same mission, she eliminated a crew-served weapon system at approximately 1,450 meters under time pressure, using an improvised range card and no supported position. Actions are documented in my after-action. In the second mission, she declined a shot with confirmed civilian presence in the impact corridor, then immediately transitioned and successfully engaged 2 armed fighters threatening the extraction element, enabling the recovery of a hostage and the intact return of the assault team. He looked at the panel. That is the operational record. The review can determine how to characterize it. Down. Drent asked Mara to walk through the declined shot in her own words. She did, and then she put the technical analysis on the table and walked through the geometry. Colonel Whitmore picked up Penheld and said, "The analysis is self-serving." She constructed it after the fact. The geometry of a shooting position doesn't change based on when you calculate it, Mara said. You're not in a position to argue with the intelligence assessment of the threat. I'm in a position to argue with any characterization of what I saw from a position I was physically on, she said. Up there. Neither were you effectively. You declined to execute your role. Role is overwatch and support, she said, not executing shots that risk killing civilians, because a targeting package didn't account for ground-level geometry. Option looked at the panel. This is precisely the attitude I'm documenting. The inability to subordinate emotional response to operational necessity. One of the panel officers, a quiet man named Briggs, who had said nothing until this moment, spoke up. Halden, can you describe the collateral risk assessment in the original targeting package for the secondary objective? Halden paused. The package identified the target's position and established conditions for a clean shot. Did the collateral risk assessment specifically address the possibility of civilian presence in the compound courtyard during the breach window? Another pause, shorter but visible. The compound was assessed as a military use facility. That's not what I asked, Briggs said. The silence that followed had a specific quality, the quality of a floor giving way under careful weight. Hutton's folder, thick as it was, did not produce the page that Briggs was asking about. Because the page didn't exist. The collateral risk assessment hadn't addressed civilian presence in the breach window because the targeting package had been built around the assumption of a clean military use site. 3 children in the courtyard had not been in the model. Mara had known this. She had known it from the moment she saw the children. Because the moment she saw them, she understood that their presence was in the intelligence, not an anomaly in the field. And a gap in the intelligence was not something she was required to compensate for by adjusting her rules of engagement. Whitmore looked at his notes. Mara Voss, he said. I'm going to ask you something directly. When you declined the shot, was it because you lacked the capability to take it, because you were uncertain about the outcome, or because you made a conscious determination that civilian safety took precedence? Datum the 3rd, she said, I had the shot. I was not uncertain about the outcome. I made a determination that civilian safety took precedence over a targeting objective that was not primary to the mission. The primary objective being the hostage, which was recovered successfully. Whitmore wrote something. He looked at Briggs. Briggs looked at the third panel member, a woman named Aldous, who had been steady and quiet throughout, and Aldous gave a very small nod that meant something the three of them understood. Halton saw it too. Nice. And his composure, which had been total from the beginning, developed a hairline crack, nothing visible in his face. But the way he straightened in his chair had the quality of a man preparing for a different argument than the one he'd planned. Besides, the review panel recessed for deliberation. Mara sat in the corridor outside the briefing structure on a concrete step and drank a bottle of water that had been in the sun long enough to be unpleasantly warm. Harlan came out 10 minutes into the recess and stood near her without sitting. Briggs was Army Ranger before he went, Harlan said. He knows what a collateral risk gap looks like in a targeting package. I figured something like that. She said you did well in there. She looked at him from Harlan. That was substantial. Thank you, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Your grandfather's technical analysis. His the wind layer methodology. I had Strand look at the formal literature, the two papers that cite the pseudonymous attribution. It's the same framework, identical conceptual foundation. He developed it over about 15 years, she said. He tested it in field conditions that I never had access to. What I have is a simplified version. He could teach to someone in 3 summers. A simplified version that outperformed everything on this element, Harlan said. He would say it's because the simplified version strips out the parts that make you overthink it, she said. He was very suspicious of overcomplication, Harlan almost smiled. It moved through the corner of his mouth and then was gone. Man, he was, she said. He was also difficult and stubborn, and he had a 30-year grudge against anyone who had ever told him. He was wrong about anything. It wasn't easy. She looked at the bottle in her hands. He was the best person I've ever known, and he was not easy at all. Lasted 40 minutes. When the panel reconvened, Whitmore did the talking. He laid out the findings in the precise ordered language of military administrative procedure, which compressed events into their institutional forms, and drained them of everything individual. Sat and listened and extracted from the formal language the things it actually meant. Undisclosed training was found to be an administrative omission rather than deliberate deception, given the absence of an applicable disclosure category. Records would be updated with the full background documentation. No disciplinary action on that count. The decline shot was found to be consistent with applicable rules of engagement, given confirmed civilian presence in the engagement corridor. The decision was classified as a tactical judgment call under time pressure. No disciplinary action on that count either. Halden's recommendation for removal from operational roles was denied. Whitmore looked at her directly. Corpsman Voss, your record of action in both missions documents a consistent pattern of sound judgment, effective execution, and appropriate prioritization of mission objectives and civilian protection requirements. The panel's finding is that your presence on this element is operationally beneficial, and that both decisions under review reflect decred on your service. She held herself very still, not because she was afraid of showing relief, but because there was something larger than relief in the room with her, something she didn't have a clean word for, and she was afraid if she moved it would break. Thank you, she said, outside the briefing structure. Fossey was leaning against the wall with his arms folded. He'd been there, she understood, for the entire recess. He straightened when she came out. Well, he said. Cleared, she said. Exhaled, not a dramatic exhale. Just a controlled release like a cable going slack. Good, he said. And then because he was Foz, and he couldn't leave it entirely alone. For the record, I thought Halden was wrong from the beginning. No, you did, she said. You told me on the helicopter pad. I did, he looked at her. I was wrong about you. On. The first week, he said it cleanly, without preamble, the way he did things when he'd made a decision. You weren't the only one, she said. No, he said. But I was loud about it. She almost smiled. You did. Once accepting the mild indictment and walked away. That was Foss. Halden came out of the briefing structure 7 minutes after she did. He had his folder under his arm and his composure fully reassembled, which was impressive in its way. He looked at her once as he passed. He didn't speak. He kept walking toward the admin building. She watched him go and understood that a man like Halden did not absorb a panel finding as a final answer. He absorbed it as a setback in a longer process, and the longer process was not over. 2 days later, she was in the medical tent running her morning supply check when Ruiz appeared in the doorway with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. It was a specific kind of serious, the kind that arrived with information, not a request. They've got a new mission package, he said. Harlan wants you in the brief in 20 minutes. Well, that was expected. She was restored to operational status. And the brief was the natural next step. There's something else, Ruiz said. He came a step farther into the tent. Hans found something last night, going through the historical records on your grandfather. A citation in the sealed portion of his service file, only accessible through the IG records cross-reference that Drent's office opened during your review. He paused. Wasn't just a long-range specialist. Last operational tour, he trained a full cohort of Marines in the wind layer methodology, classified internal to his unit. That training cohort's operational record was exceptional. Extraordinarily low collateral incidents, high mission success rates. He stopped. She looked at him, and 4 members of that cohort are currently serving. 2 are on active training staffs. He let it sit for a moment. Mara, the methodology he taught you isn't just his personal technique. It's the foundation of a classified training program that was archived and never formally disseminated because the service file was sealed when he retired. He looked at her steadily. If that program gets resurfaces through your case review, through Drent's records access, it doesn't just clear your name. It potentially changes how advanced marksmanship is taught across the entire branch. When did Strand find this? She said. Last night, Ruiz said. He went straight to Harlan. And Harlan. Ruiz hesitated for the first time. And the hesitation was not uncertainty about the facts. It was the hesitation of someone who had seen the next part of the story and was choosing how to deliver it. Also has access to the IG cross-reference, Ruiz said. He was seed on the same document release. She felt the room shift slightly. The way it shifts when the ground you thought was stable turns out to have been moving the whole time. He knows, she said. He's known since yesterday morning, Ruiz said. And he hasn't reported it up the chain yet, which means he's deciding what to do with it before anyone else can. She understood what that meant. Halden, with that information and the wrong motivation, didn't just have leverage over her career. He had leverage over a methodology, over a classified program, over the memory of Thomas Voss and everything that memory represented, and he would use it not to do anything constructive with it, but to protect his own position from the consequences of a review panel that had just told him he was wrong. How much time do we have, she said, before what? Before he does something with it that we can't undo. Ruiz looked at her. Strand thinks he may have already started. And then Harlan's voice came over the compound intercom, not routine, not the standard brief announcement, but the tone he used when something had changed and changed fast. All element leads to the ops center now. And then Harlan's voice came over the compound intercom, not routine, not the standard brief announcement, but the tone he used when something had changed and changed fast. All element leads to the ops center. Now Mara was moving before Ruiz finished, turning toward the door. Ops center was the nerve of Blackridge, a reinforced structure at the compound center, with hardened communications equipment, 3 separate display screens, and a map table that took up most of the available floor space. When Mara arrived, Harlan was already at the map table with Strand beside him and Voss coming in from the opposite entrance, still pulling on his jacket. Pavel's Ranger Element lead, a staff sergeant named Groves, who had taken over the day before, while Bell was being evaluated for a knee injury sustained during the hostage recovery, stood near the comm station with a look on his face like someone had handed him bad news in a foreign language. It was there, too. He had not left the phobie yet, which now made sense. And Halden was not there, which also made sense in a different way. Island looked up when Mara came through the door. He looked at her for a half-second longer than the situation required, and in that half-second she read the room correctly. Sit, he said to the group. Nobody sat all right. And he pulled a printed document from the map table and held it up. A few minutes ago, Intelligence Officer Halden submitted a formal request to Regional Command to classify the Thomas Voss methodology documentation under operational security protocols. The request cites active mission sensitivity and requests an immediate hold on all IG records cross-reference materials pending a separate command review. Nobody spoke for a moment. In plain language, Fossey said. He's trying to bury it. He's trying to control access to it, Harlan said. Which is not the same thing legally, but has the same practical effect if it goes through before anyone can respond. He set the document down. Its office received the request simultaneously with us because of the open IG cross-reference. Has 36 hours to file a counterposition before the request goes to classification review. Who had been standing near the wall with his tablet and his recorder, and the composed affect of a man who processed things internally before he showed them, said the counterposition requires documented grounds. Specifically, it requires evidence that the classification request is not operationally motivated, that it's being used to suppress information that would otherwise be relevant to a personnel matter. The review panel already cleared, Voss said. The personnel matter is closed. The classification request doesn't address the panel's finding, Drent said. Addresses the underlying methodology documentation. Can argue that the Thomas Voss training records and the archived cohort program constitute independent operational intelligence, regardless of their connection to Voss's personnel case. If he makes that argument successfully, the materials go under classification and your access disappears, along with any chance of formally documenting the programs, Strand said. Yes, Drent said. Mara had been standing near the door, listening, working through the structure of what Halden had done. He had been seed on the same records lease they had. He had seen the scope of it, not just her grandfather's service record, but the cohort training program, the classified methodology framework, the exceptional operational record of the Marines Thomas Voss had trained, and he had understood immediately that if any of that became formally documented and attributed, it would not only vindicate Mara completely, it would also expose the gap in his own targeting package, in a context that made that gap look not like an honest intelligence error, but like the kind of systemic failure that ended careers. He wasn't trying to bury Thomas Voss's legacy. He was trying to protect his own position from what that legacy revealed about the quality of his work. What do we need for the counterposition, Mara said. Looked at her. Documentation demonstrating that the methodology in question has active operational value that is not appropriately served by classification, testimony, or evidence establishing continuity between the historical program and its current application. And at least one senior officer willing to formally support the counterposition on the record, Harlan said. I'll go on record, Drent made a note. That helps. It's not sufficient alone, Bellstrand said. On base of his statement about the extraction goes into the counterposition file, it establishes the methodology's current operational application in direct terms. On medical evaluation for his knee, Grove said. On evaluation, not incapacitation, Strand said. He can still give a statement. Groves thought about that for a moment, the way a man thinks about something when he's deciding whether it's his call to make. I'll ask him. There's one more thing, Drent said. He said it in the way people say things when the thing they're about to say is the most important thing, and they know it, and they've been waiting for the right moment in the conversation to put it down. Archived cohort program documentation. The records I can access through the cross-reference include the original training curriculum, the operational results, and the authorization signatures. The authorization signatures on the classified version of the program is from a general officer, Allen. Looked up Brigadier General Marcus Elroy, Drent said. Authorized the cohort program in Thomas Voss's final tour. He is currently serving as Deputy Commandant for Training and Education. The room went quiet in a specific way, the way a room goes quiet when a name lands that changes the scale of what's being discussed. Said Elroy knows about the program, he authorized it, Drent said. He's kept track of what happened to the documentation after it was archived is a separate question. His name is on the authorization, which means if we can reach him before Halden's classification request goes through. He is standing to formally object to the classification on the grounds of his original authorization, Harlan said. The Drent said he does. Mara looked at the map table. She looked at the printed document Halden had submitted and the dense administrative language it contained, and she thought about what her grandfather would have made of all this, the bureaucratic machinery of it, forms and the review panels and the classification requests and the counterpositions. He had been deeply suspicious of institutions even when he served them faithfully. He had told her once that the most dangerous thing about power wasn't what it did openly, but what it did when it thought no one was watching. Halden had thought he was doing something no one would catch in time. He had miscalculated by 36 hours. How do we reach Elroy, she said. I have the channels, Drent said. It's not a simple call to make. He's a general officer, the request has to be framed correctly. Correctly, Harlan said. What do you need from us in the meantime? Everything. Strand found. Drent said the full documentation package from the cross-reference. And I need Corpsman Voss's written account of the training methodology as she received it, not the technical analysis from the review, but a narrative account. Thomas Voss taught her, how he taught it, what the underlying principles were. In her words, he looked at Mara. It needs to be yours. Firsthand. Connecting the historical program to its living application. At his gaze. How long do I have? 6 hours, he said. I need to start drafting the counterposition tonight. She went to the medical tent and sat at the folding table with a legal pad and a pen, and she started writing about herself, about her grandfather. She wrote about the first summer when she was 17, and he had told her flatly that she was too eager, and that eagerness was the enemy of accuracy. She wrote about lying in the Montana grass for 2 hours without moving, while he explained the wind in a way that made it feel like a living thing with moods and preferences. She wrote about the time she missed a shot at 800 meters because she rushed the trigger, and he had said nothing at all, just waited. And silence was more instructive than any correction could have been. She wrote about the day he explained the wind layer methodology, for the first time drawing it on the back of a feed store receipt with a stubby pencil because he never carried a proper notebook explaining the transition zones between elevation levels, the way air behaved differently above and below thermal gradients, the way you could read what was happening 50 meters above the valley floor by watching the shimmer at ground level. She wrote for 4 hours without stopping. When she gave the pages to Drent, he read the first 3 without looking up. Then he set them down and looked at her. "This is going to be enough," he said. She wasn't sure if he meant enough for the counterposition, or enough for something larger. She didn't ask. Drent's call to General Elroy's office went through the following morning. Mara was not in the room for it. She was in the medical bay running her morning checks, but Strand found her 40 minutes later and told her what had happened, which was not what anyone had expected. Elroy had known about the archived program. He had known about it for 22 years, which was how long it had been sitting in a classified archive that nobody had opened, because the officer who would have known to look for it was Thomas Voss himself, who had retired and then died before anyone thought to ask him where the documentation went. Elroy had been a colonel when he authorized the program. He had gone on to a career in training development, and he had carried the knowledge of what Thomas Voss built like a debt he hadn't figured out how to repay. He had also, in the 12 hours between Drent's call and the outcome, filed a formal objection to Halden's classification request through his own channels. Not just a letter. A memorandum to the Classification Review Authority with his authorization signature at the bottom, and a 2-page addendum explaining the program's origins, its operational value, and his position that the materials were not appropriately served by a new classification layer. A classification request was suspended pending review. Harlan told her outside the op center that afternoon. Standing in the same spot where he had first told her, she was restricted from operational planning, the geography of the base, making a quiet note of how much had changed. Elroy went further than Drent asked him to, Harlan said. He's requesting a formal debrief of your methodology application against the archived program records. He wants to assess whether the framework your grandfather taught you is complete or whether parts of the original program are missing from what you received. What about that? There are probably parts missing, she said. 3 summers is not the full program. He simplified it to what he thought I could absorb. Roy's office wants to talk to you directly, Harlan said. As a review subject, as a source, she absorbed that. The weight of it was different from what she'd expected, not triumph exactly, but something that had more texture. Something that involved a man who had been dead for 8 months suddenly having his work seen clearly by people who could do something with it. She said. They'll schedule it through Drent's office, he said. Problems. After the classification review closes. She nodded, then she said, and Harlan's expression didn't change, but his answer arrived about a half-second slower than usual. And is conducting a separate review of the targeting package from the hostage recovery mission, he said. Lateral risk gap that Briggs identified in the panel session command wants to understand how that gap developed. Who built the package, what the review process was, whether it met standard. He paused. Built the package. Yes, she said. He will have an opportunity to explain the gap, Harlan said. He's a capable man and he may explain it adequately. The explanation will exist on record regardless. He looked at her directly. He did with the classification request, trying to move the documentation before anyone could act on it. That's also on record now. Its office documented the timeline. The request went in 40 minutes after Halden received the cross-reference release. It's not a coincidence. Anyone is going to accept as coincidence, I think. He hurt his own case by moving too fast, Harlan said. Halden, they're very good at the long game. They don't do well when they're in a hurry. She thought about the panel session. The way Halden had straightened in his chair when Briggs asked the question about the collateral risk assessment. A hairline crack in his composure. A man who had been operating from a position of control for years, who had built elaborate patient cases against people he needed to remove, suddenly found himself on a compressed timeline with a record that was being assembled around him by people he hadn't anticipated. Right. He had moved too fast because for the first time in a long time someone had moved faster. The targeting package review took 11 days. Aya wasn't present for any of it. She was back on operational status, running missions with the team, and treating the kind of injuries that came with operating in contested terrain. The friction burns and the shrapnel fragments and the twisted ankles and the one serious wound that came in from a Ranger Element patrol on day 8. A young corporal named Finch with a through-and-through in his left thigh that had missed the femoral artery by a margin that took 10 years off everyone in the room. 5. She was calm about it in the way her grandfather had taught her to be calm. Not the absence of stress, but the management of it. The way you slow your breathing and work the problem and save the thinking about what almost happened for. Later, when the work is done, and the patient is breathing and the adrenaline has metabolized. He lost some blood and some time, and he would have a scar that he'd be explaining for the rest of his life, but he was alive, and he would stay that way. When she came out of the medical bay after the last of his stabilization work, Fosse was in the corridor. He had been there for most of the procedure, not watching just near. In the way that people stay near things they're not sure about. She said. Fosse exhaled. Good. He needs evac to the surgical facility tonight. The wound needs a proper OR for the complete repair. I'll arrange it, Fosse said. He didn't move immediately. He looked at her hands. She had cleaned them, but she'd been working fast in there, and she'd missed a spot near her left wrist. He didn't say anything about it. He just looked and then looked away. And she understood that in his particular emotional vocabulary, this was something significant. He said. I'm fine, she said then, because it was true, and because Fosse deserved the honest version. I'll be fine. Give me 20 minutes, take 30, he said, and walked away to arrange the evac. She went to the medical tent and sat on her cot and gave herself exactly the 20 minutes she'd claimed, which was not quite enough and was the best available option. The results of the targeting package review arrived on day 12, delivered to Harlan's desk in the form of a formal findings report from Regional Command. He called her into the briefing structure to read it, which was unusual. He didn't usually share command-level documentation with attached personnel. The fact that he did told her what was in it before she picked it up. Findings were 14 pages. She read them in order. The targeting package for the hostage recovery mission had been assessed as deficient in 3 specific respects. The collateral risk assessment had failed to account for civilian presence within the compound during the breach window. Intelligence basis for the compound's classification as a military use facility was found to be single-source unverified and not flagged as such in the package documentation. And the secondary targeting objective, the network commander, had been included in the mission package without the independent command approval acquired for lethal targeting in an operation where the primary objective was a non-lethal hostage recovery. That last finding was the one with teeth. Including lethal secondary targeting in a hostage recovery package without independent command approval was not a procedural oversight. It was a violation of the operational framework that governed how missions were constructed, and it was the kind of violation that required a deliberate decision by the person building the package. Patton had included the secondary targeting objective because he wanted it in the mission. He had not sought the required approval, because seeking approval would have required him to disclose the basis for the objective and submit it to scrutiny he didn't want. He had built the mission around a shot he wanted taken. He had pressured Mara to take it, and when she didn't, he had tried to frame her refusal as the failure. The report recommended a formal disciplinary review of Halden's conduct in the construction of the targeting package, a review of his previous targeting work in the regional cell, and a suspension of his operational authority pending the outcome. Mara set the report down. Harlan was watching her from across the table. The disciplinary review will take time, he said. Often. Could be months. He'll have representation, and the process will be thorough because it has to be. I understand, she said. But his operational authority is suspended, effective immediately. Off the targeting cell. He paused. He's being recalled to the regional headquarters. Pending review. She looked at the window outside. The compound was doing its afternoon business vehicles, moving personnel crossing the gravel yard, the distant sound of the range. Normal. The kind of normal that had continued through all of it, indifferent to the smaller dramas playing out in briefing rooms and medical tents. Argue the findings, she said. It wasn't hopeful or pessimistic. It was just true. He'll argue them, Harlan agreed. And some of his arguments may have merit on specific points. The process is designed to work through that. He picked up the report and straightened it on the table. But the unauthorized lethal targeting in a hostage recovery package, that's documented, it's on record, and he built it. I can't argue that away. She nodded. There's something else, Harlan said. He reached into the folder and produced a second document, shorter, a single page with a formal letterhead. She recognized as regional command. Elroy's office also submitted a recommendation in connection with the Thomas Voss methodology review. They're recommending that your field application of the methodology be formally documented as part of the declassification process for the cohort training program. Like your range work, your operational applications, the technical analysis from the review, all of it becomes part of the program record. She looked at the single-page document. What does that mean practically? It means the training program gets surfaced, updated, and formally circulated through the marksmanship training system, he said, with your grandfather's name on it. With yours on it as the field documentation source, he set the page down. It'll happen overnight. This kind of thing moves slowly through the system. It will happen. She looked at the document for a long moment. Thomas Voss, who had spent his post-service years, convinced that what he'd built had been forgotten and wasted, who had sat on a Montana porch in the late evening and told his granddaughter to go do something with what he'd given her, because he hadn't been able to do enough with it himself. I had died 8 months ago in a house full of land and silence, leaving behind a granddaughter he wasn't sure he'd done right by, and a methodology drawn on the back of a feed store receipt that had survived in her hands and come all the way here, at a forward operating base in a contested mountain region where it had saved lives he would never know about. She pushed the thought down, not away, just down to where it could sit without taking over. Thank you, she said to Harlan. She meant it plainly, without decoration. He said, I documented it. She picked up the command findings report and the Elroy memo, and she carried them back to the medical tent and filed them in the folder she kept in her wall locker, and she sat on her cot for a moment before starting her evening supply check. She was halfway through the check when Fosse appeared in the tent entrance. He had his hands in his pockets, and the particular expression he wore when he'd been turning something over for a while and had finally finished turning it, on Star recommendation. He said Harlan submitted it this morning. Valor device. She looked up from the supply log. Off missions. Said the IED read the technical shot. Declined shot and the 2 subsequent engagements on the extraction corridor. In Finch yesterday. He paused. Harlan wrote the recommendation himself. Delegate it. She was quiet for a moment. That's not certain to go through, she said. Oh. He said. Nothing certain, but Harlan doesn't submit recommendations. He doesn't think we'll hold. He looked at her steadily. You should know he went through 3 drafts. I saw the first one on his desk by accident. He wrote it and rewrote it because he wanted it to be exactly right. She held the supply log without reading it. He's not a man who does that easily, Fosse said. No, she said. Fosse was quiet for a moment. I was going to say something else, he said. And I don't want to make it bigger than it is. So I'll just say it. He looked at the tent floor briefly, then back at her. That first day. When you came in with the hard case and I made the comment about the rifle. I knew the case wasn't medical equipment. I knew exactly what it was. I just decided to pretend I didn't because pretending was easier than asking what it meant. He paused. That was on me, not on you. It was more honest than she'd expected from him. Complete. Thank you, she said genuinely. He nodded once and left before the moment could become something neither of them wanted it to be. She went back to the supply log. Outside, the sun was going down behind the mountains, and the range was quiet, and the compound's evening sounds were starting up generators, cycling mess hall opening, the low hum of a base doing what bases do at the end of a day. She finished the check, closed the log, and was about to start her evening range session when Strand appeared. He said nothing at first. He stood in the entrance and looked at her with the patient-level attention he brought to things he considered important. It's leaving tomorrow, he said. He came by to tell you before he goes. Op Center. She found Drent packing his tablet and recorder into a carry bag. He looked up when she came in. I wanted to let you know before I submitted the final counterposition documentation, he said. It's going in tonight. Elroy's objection. Nothing's your written account. Buckland's statements. All's the full package. Paused. Solid. The classification request will be denied. Thank you, said, for moving as fast as you did. I moved as fast as the record allowed me to, he said. He zipped the carry bag. I'll tell you something I probably shouldn't, because I'm good at deciding what's appropriate, and this is close to the line. He looked at her directly. I've done about 60 of these preliminary inquiries. I know what they look like when someone is covering something, and what they look like when someone is just trying to do the job the right way in difficult conditions. He picked up the bag. I knew what yours looked like about 3 minutes as to the first conversation. She held his gaze, and you still had to go through the process. I still had to go through the process, he confirmed. That's the job. He offered his hand. She shook it. Horseman safe travel, she said. He left. She stood in the empty op center for a moment. The screens were dark, the map table clear. It was the room where everything had been decided, and now it was just a room again. She was turning to go when her eye caught something on the edge of the map table, a document that hadn't been there earlier, set off to one side with the careful deliberateness of something placed to be found. She crossed the room and picked it up. It was a single-page transfer order. Her name at the top dated 3 days earlier. It took her a moment to understand what she was reading, because the document was not what she expected. It was not a discharge order, not a disciplinary transfer, not a restriction. It was a formal request originating not from Halden's office, not from the review panel, but from a training command address she didn't immediately recognize, requesting her temporary reassignment to assist in the formal resurrection of the Mara Voss cohort program under General Elroy's office. She read it twice. At the bottom, in the space where the originating authority signed, there was a name she hadn't seen on any document before: Brigadier General Marcus Elroy himself. Not his staff, not his office. The man. She turned the page over. On the back, in handwriting that belonged to no form she'd ever filled out, someone had written 4 words in pencil. He would be proud. She stood in the empty op center with the transfer order in her hands and the 4 penciled words on the back, and she didn't know if it was Elroy who'd written them, or someone in Drent's office, or Harlan himself, and it didn't entirely matter. Because whoever wrote them had known Thomas Voss and had known what he'd tried to build, and they had seen what his granddaughter had brought here and kept alive. She folded the transfer order carefully and put it in her breast pocket. Outside, the last of the evening light was going off the mountains, and the range was empty, and the compound was settling into its night. Then somewhere in a regional headquarters office, a man who had tried to use the weight of the institution against her was sitting with a suspended operational authority and an investigation that was going to take months and would not go quietly. She should have felt the resolution of it completely. Outwards. She almost did, but there was one thing she hadn't allowed herself to think about yet. One thing she had kept in its own compartment since the beginning. And standing in the empty op center with her grandfather's name on a transfer order and 4 words. On the back of the page, the compartment opened. Island's Bronze Star recommendation. She was glad for it. But the recommendation had gone through the formal channel, which meant it had gone through the same regional command structure that was currently reviewing Halden's conduct. Halden, who was methodical and patient even when he was in a hurry, had been in that structure for 7 years. 7 years of relationships, of people who owed him professional debts, of files and documentation, and the accumulated leverage of a man who had spent his career understanding that information was the actual currency of power. He was suspended, he was under review, but he was not finished. And the recommendation bearing her name was sitting in the same system he still had access to. She pulled the transfer order out of her pocket and looked at it again. The date. 3 days ago, Elroy's signature. Then she thought about what Ruiz had said when he'd come to the tent. He's known since yesterday morning, and he hasn't reported it up the chain yet. Which means he's deciding what to do with it before anyone else can. Had moved fast on the classification request. Faster. Then was smart because he was in a hurry. But there was one thing Halden had known that she hadn't been thinking about clearly until this moment. He had known about the transfer order. He had access to the same command channels as Elroy's office. If the transfer order had been generated 3 days ago, Halden had known about it before his operational authority was suspended. Before the targeting review findings came down, he had known his position was collapsing before anyone told him it was collapsing. And he had still filed the classification request. Which meant the classification request wasn't his last move. It was a distraction. She stood very still in the empty op center. If the classification request was a distraction, if Halden had known it wouldn't hold, had known Elroy's objection would kill it, filed it anyway, to pull everyone's attention toward the documentation battle, then what had he actually been doing in the time everyone was focused on the counter position? She crossed to the comm station. She didn't have authorization to run a query from here, but the system was logged in from the last operator who'd used it, and she found the message traffic archive before she fully decided she was going to look. She searched Heldon's name. There were 37 outgoing messages in the last 72 hours. Most were flagged in the standard traffic log. 3 of them sent in a 12-hour window between the classification request and the suspension of his operational authority were addressed not to regional command, not to the IG office, not to any administrative channel. They were addressed to the review authority for the Bronze Star recommendation. She opened the first one. She read it. She sat down in the chair in front of the comm station and she read all 3. And when she was done, she understood that Heldon had not been trying to stop the transfer order or fight the targeting review or salvage the classification request. He had been trying to do something much simpler, much more targeted, and potentially much more effective. He had been building a case that the Bronze Star recommendation should be denied, on the grounds that the events it cited, the decline shot, the subsequent engagements, the hostage recovery had been manufactured. Mara had deliberately allowed the primary extraction to become more dangerous than it needed to be in order to create opportunities to demonstrate her capability. That the 2 fighters on the extraction corridor had not been a genuine threat she'd neutralized, but a situation she had. Through her refusal to take the secondary shot when the commander was still coordinating his forces, allowed to develop into a crisis. It was the same argument as before restructured. She was too emotional. Her refusal had consequences. The consequences were used to build her reputation. It was not a good argument. Anyone who read it against Harlan's after action and Bell's statement would see the gaps immediately. But it was in the review authority's inbox. It had been there for 36 hours. And if the review authority had read it before the targeting review findings landed, before Heldon's authority was suspended, it would have carried the weight of an active intelligence officer's professional assessment. She needed to know if anyone at the review authority had acted on it before the suspension documents arrived. She picked up the nearest radio handset and called Harlan's quarters. He answered on the second call. "I need you in the ops center," she said. "I found something in the message traffic." He was there in 4 minutes. He was wearing what he slept in, which was not something she'd ever seen before, and he looked at the screen with the same methodical focus he brought to everything, reading all 3 messages without speaking. When he finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "How long ago were these sent?" he said. "Last one was 36 hours ago," she said, before his authority was suspended. Harlan stood up from the station. He rubbed his jaw with one hand, not a habitual gesture, not something she'd seen him do before. The kind of gesture that meant he was working through something he hadn't planned for. "The review authority for the Bronze Star recommendation is Colonel Aldous," he said. She recognized the name Aldous, the quiet woman on the review panel. The one who had given the small nod at the end of the deliberation. "She was on the panel that cleared me," Mara said. "Yes," Harlan said. She read Heldon's targeting package review. "She knows the context." He looked at the screen again. "But she also received these messages before she had that context. If the timeline is what you're saying," Mara said. Harlan picked up the ops center's secure handset. He looked at it for a moment. "I'm going to call her," he said. "Now." "Tonight it's late," she said. "I know what time it is," he said. And he dialed. The call lasted 9 minutes. Mara sat in the chair by the comm station and listened to Harlan's side of it, measured without apology for the hour, laying out the timeline with the same clarity he brought to mission briefs. He referenced the targeting review findings twice. I did not ask Aldous to make a particular decision. He gave her the information and let her draw the conclusion, which was Harlan operating at his most effective. When he hung up, he set the handset down and looked at Mara. She received the messages, he said. She had not yet acted on them. She was waiting for the full picture from the targeting review before taking any action on the recommendation. Mara exhaled. "She's a thorough officer," Harlan said. "She builds the complete record before she moves." He looked at the window. "Probably counted on her moving faster." He miscalculated again. Mara said. "Yes." Harlan said, "Twice in the same week is a pattern." He looked at her. "Go get some sleep, Aldous. We'll review the recommendation with the full context in the morning." She stood up. She still had the transfer order in her breast pocket. She put her hand over it briefly, without thinking, a small involuntary gesture, like checking for something you need to know is still there. Harlan saw it. He didn't say anything about it. She walked out of the op center and across the compound toward the support tent, and the night was cold and clear in the way mountain nights got cold and clear, and the stars were doing the thing they did at altitude, down close and very bright, and she walked across the gravel and thought about the fact that it was not over. The recommendation would be reviewed. Aldous would see the full picture, and she would make a sound decision. 5. The targeting review findings would carry weight. Holden's messages would be read in context. Probably. Almost certainly. But there was a document she hadn't seen yet, one she'd caught a reference to in the third of Halden's messages, mentioned almost in passing, cited as supporting evidence for his argument. File number. She didn't recognize from a channel she hadn't accessed dated 6 weeks before any of this had started. 6 weeks before she had arrived at Blackridge FOB. Which meant it predated her. Which meant Halden had been building something before she walked through the gate, before the range session, before the first mission. She stopped in the middle of the gravel yard. If there was a prior file document that existed before she arrived, that Halden had cited as the foundation of his argument against her, then his case against her wasn't constructed in response to her actions. It was constructed in advance of them, and it was constructed in advance. The question wasn't what she had done wrong. The question was what Halden had known before she got here and why. The question was what Halden had known before she got here and why. She stood in the gravel yard for another 10 seconds, the cold coming off the mountains in slow waves, and then she turned around and went back to the ops center. Alan was still there. He had not left, which meant some part of him had known she would come back. She told him about the file number. She read it to him from memory. She had always been able to hold numbers cleanly. Other thing. Her grandfather had drilled into her because a misremembered range is a missed shot, and Harlan went to the comm station and ran it without asking her how she'd found it. A file opened. It was a personnel assessment, pre-deployment, generated 6 weeks before her arrival at Blackridge, authored by a staff officer in the regional personnel cell, whose name meant nothing to Mara. The subject line was her name, and the document's initiating authority, the person who had requested the assessment be generated, was Grant Halden. She read it standing over Harlan's shoulder. Halden had requested a profile on her before she arrived. Standard procedure pre-deployment assessments were initiated by receiving unit commanders, not by intelligence officers with no direct command relationship to the incoming personnel. He had pulled her service record, her training documentation, her application materials, and one additional item that stopped her cold when she saw it listed a query against the Voss family surname in the Marine Corps Historical Records database. He had known about Thomas Voss before she set foot on this base, about her training, not the details, but he had seen the name Voss run it and found the service record. The sealed record, which at that point hadn't been accessed through the IG cross-reference yet. But the existence of the record, the fact of a decorated Marine sniper with that surname, was visible even in the sealed index. Harlan read it twice. He was very still. He knew who your grandfather was, Harlan said. He knew the name existed in the record, she said. He didn't have the full picture, but he knew enough to be watching. Harlan said, not rhetorically. He wanted her read on it. She had been working on that since the gravel yard. Because Halden has been building targeting packages in this region for 3 years, she said. And somewhere in those 3 years, the Thomas Voss methodology or something close to it came up. Maybe in an after-action, maybe in a training document, maybe in a conversation with someone who'd been trained by the cohort program. He knew the methodology existed and that it was better than what his targeting assumptions were built around. She paused. If the methodology got formally surfaced, it would expose gaps in his work, not just the hostage recovery package. His whole record here. Harlan looked at the screen. He was managing a threat before it arrived. Yes, she said. I showed up with the right surname and a rifle he couldn't explain, and he started building a file against me before I unpacked my gear. It should have made her angry. It did make her angry in a low structural way that she recognized as something she'd have to process later. Not now. Now, the anger was less useful than the clarity. This goes in Drent's counterposition package, she said. It's already submitted, Harlan said. Then it goes to Aldous, she said. Before she reviews the recommendation in the morning, Harlan looked at her. He didn't argue with the logic. He picked up the secure handset again and called Aldous a second time, and she answered with the patience of a person who had decided some hours ago that this night was going to be longer than planned. The second call lasted 6 minutes. When it was done, Harlan set the handset down and said she's requesting a full records transfer from the personnel cell on Halden's pre-deployment query. I'd have it by morning. Nodded. Go sleep, he said. There is nothing else you can do tonight that won't wait. She did sleep, which surprised her. Well, and not long, 4 hours, maybe 5, but the kind of sleep that comes after something has been resolved to its furthest point and the rest is out of your hands. She woke before the base did in the gray pre-dawn quiet and lay on her cot looking at the canvas ceiling. She thought about the 4 words on the back of the transfer order. He would be proud. She turned that over for a while. She wasn't sure pride was the right frame for Thomas Voss, who had been suspicious of the idea that good outcomes validated the decisions that produced them. He'd told her once that the problem with pride was that it looked backward, and looking backward was how you stopped reading the ground ahead. But he would have wanted to know his work had mattered. She was certain of that. He had cared underneath the difficult exterior and the long silences with a thoroughness that cost him things he'd never fully described to her. He had given her 3 summers and a methodology and a warning she was still learning to understand, and he had died not knowing if any of it had stuck. It had stuck. She got up before Reveille, dressed, and went to the medical bay to run her morning checks. The findings came down at 1940. Aldous had reviewed the pre-deployment query documentation overnight, cross-referenced it against the targeting review findings, and Heldon's 3 messages to her office, and submitted her assessment to Regional Command before the morning brief. The assessment was 14 pages, which was the same length as the targeting review findings, and it was thorough in a way that left no room for selective reading. Heldon had initiated an unauthorized pre-deployment personnel profile on an incoming service member. He had used that profile to build a preemptive case against her credibility before she had done anything to warrant scrutiny. He had then, over the course of 2 missions, leveraged his position as intelligence officer to pressure her toward a rules of engagement violation, characterized her legally sound refusal as a mental or emotional deficiency, filed an insubordination report that misrepresented the nature of her decision, attempted to suppress documents that would vindicate her, and submitted misleading communications to the Bronze Star Review Authority with the intent to deny a commendation he had personal and professional reasons to want blocked. The assessment used the word misconduct 4 times. It recommended Heldon's immediate referral for formal disciplinary proceedings. A comprehensive review of all targeting packages he had authored in the regional cell over the preceding 3 years, and his permanent removal from any operational role pending the outcome of those proceedings. Ian read it to the element in the morning brief. Not all of it. The operational sections, the relevant findings, the bottom line. When he finished, the room was quiet in the way it gets quiet when something large has finally landed where it was supposed to land. I said, 3 years of packages. Yes, Harlan said. How many missions came off those packages? That's what the review will determine, Harlan said. He looked at the table. He looked like a man doing arithmetic he didn't enjoy. If his targeting assumptions were systematically flawed, then some of those missions had gaps we didn't know about, Harlan said. We know that. Command knows that. That's what the review is for. The room absorbed it. The implications were not clean, and nobody was pretending they were. 3 years of operations was not a small number. And the possibility that the intelligence framework underlying some of those operations had been built around the professional self-protection of one man rather than sound analysis was the kind of thing that heavily, even on people trained to carry weight. I said quietly. She called it in the op center. She saw what the classification request was actually doing. Nobody answered that directly, but several people in the room looked at Mara, and what was in those looks was not the complicated, conditional, reluctant reassessment she'd been getting for weeks. It was something simpler and more complete. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Heldon left Blackridge that afternoon. She didn't see him go. She was in the medical bay with Finch's follow-up documentation when the vehicle departed, but Strand told her later that he had come out of the admin building with his bags and walked to the vehicle without stopping, without speaking to anyone, without looking back at the compound, composed, fully intact, right to the end. She thought about that, about what it cost to maintain that kind of composure when the ground had come out from under you completely. She didn't admire it exactly, but she understood it. Some people built themselves around control, because losing control felt like annihilation. Hutton had been that kind of person. He had built careful, patient structures to maintain his position and his narrative. And when those structures came down, they came down all at once, and the composure was the last wall standing. She hoped someone in his life would eventually help him understand what he'd done and why. Not because she felt generous toward him, she didn't. Not yet, maybe not for a long time, but because a man who never understood why he'd done it would do it again to someone else. That was not her problem to solve, but it was a true thing. The Bronze Star was confirmed 3 days later. Signed the recommendation. The ceremony was not elaborate. This was a forward operating base, not a parade ground, but Harlan pinned the decoration himself, and he did it with the specific gravity he reserved for things that mattered. The whole element was there, Ruiz and Fosse and Strand. And his Rangers Ellison, back from her shoulder recovery, arm in a sling but standing straight. Finch on crutches, who had insisted on being present and who looked at Mara during the ceremony with the plain, uncomplicated gratitude of someone who was alive and knew specifically why. Bell was there too. He had driven back from the surgical facility on his repaired knee, which he probably shouldn't have done. And he stood at the back of the group with his arms folded and his weathered face, doing something that wasn't quite a smile but was in the same territory. Harlan pinned the decoration and stepped back and read from the citation in the flat, formal cadence of official language, and Mara stood straight and listened to her own record described from the outside: the IED identification, the technical shot, decline shot, the extraction corridor engagements. Finch and heard in the formal language, the shape of decisions she had made under pressure without time to understand them fully until now. When it was done, there was the brief, slightly awkward pause that follows ceremony, when people aren't sure if applause is appropriate. Fosse started it, and everyone followed, and it was not a long or theatrical moment, just real. Ellen shook her hand. He held it for one additional second. Your grandfather's program starts formal review next month, he said quietly. Elroy's office. Confirmed this morning, I heard, she said. They'll want your continued input during the documentation phase. I know, she said. I'll give them everything. He nodded once and released her hand and stepped back, and that was Harlan's version of everything he wanted to say. She left Blackridge 2 weeks later on a logistics flight headed to the regional facility where General Elroy's training review team was assembled. She packed the same duffel she'd arrived with, and the hard case she still carried herself, and she stood for a moment in the empty support tent before she walked out. At the far end, the one assigned to the attached medic away from the entrance, as far from the center of things as you could get, while still technically being in the room. A fan that still didn't work at full speed, the yellow lamp circle on the canvas wall. She had been placed in the corner of the room by people who decided that's where she belonged. Out. She walked and was at the flight line. He didn't usually do send-offs, that wasn't his character, but he was there, which meant he'd decided it was worth being out of character for methodology. He said the wind layer framework, and Elroy's team documents it, formally make sure they get the transition zone calculation, right? The way you explained it to me with the thermal gradient red. That's the part that's missing from every formal system I've seen. I'll make sure, she said. He nodded. He put his hand out. She shook it. You were better at this than anyone gave you credit for, he said. From the beginning. You gave me credit early, she said. Not early enough, he said. She didn't argue with that because he was right. Left at 1700. She sat by the window and watched Blackridge FOB shrink below the gravel yard, the range where she'd shot in the evening light, while the team was finished for the day, the mountain terrain going orange in the early sun. She watched it until it was gone. She made it to Montana 6 weeks later on a 3-day pass between the first and second phases of the methodology documentation work. She drove a rental truck up into the Bitterroot Valley, where the light in late autumn was cold and clear, and the grass along the river had gone the color of old paper. She drove the road she'd driven every summer for 3 years through the gate she knew, and up the track to the house that sat above the river, with the porch where he used to keep a glass of water on the rail. The house had been left to her. She hadn't been back since the funeral. She didn't go inside. She walked up the ridge behind the house, the one where they'd spent most of the third summer, where she'd learned the thermal gradient red on a clear July afternoon, with the river glittering far below and the mountains doing what mountains do when the light is right. She walked to the spot where he'd always set up the flat shelf of rock, with the good sight line down into the valley. She sat there for a while. She thought about what he'd told her the last time they'd been on this ridge together, 2 weeks before his diagnosis, when neither of them had known yet what the next year would bring. The rifle is just a tool. Every tool can be misused. The only question is whether the person holding it has spent more time developing their skill or their judgment. Skill without judgment is just a faster way to make catastrophic mistakes. She had spent 3 years developing the skill. The judgment, she understood now, had been developing in parallel in every decision she'd made under pressure, in the IED red, and the technical shot, and the declined shot, and the corridor engagements and Finch's artery and the Opson Center at midnight, with the message traffic on the screen. She had been tested in ways she hadn't anticipated, and she had not been perfect. She had been human, which was more useful and more durable than perfect. She reached into her breast pocket and took out the bronze star. She'd been carrying it loose since the ceremony, which was probably not regulation, but it fit in her pocket and she liked having it there. She held it for a moment. The mountain light made it look less official and more like what it actually was, a piece of metal representing a series of decisions made by a person who was doing her best in conditions that didn't reward best-case assumptions. She put it back in her pocket. She thought about what Harlan had said. "You did the work, I documented it." And she thought about Foss's apology and Strand's handshake and Bell's face during the ceremony, and Finch on his crutches at the back of the group. She thought about Drent and his recorder and his 6-minute call to Elroy, and the 4 words on the back of the transfer order. She thought about Aldous and her 14-page assessment and the word misconduct 4 times. She thought about Heldon walking to the vehicle without looking back, and she let that go because carrying anger about a person who was already receiving the consequences of his own choices was weight she didn't need on this particular ridge. And she thought about her grandfather, not the decorated Marine, not the legendary methodologist, whose archived training program was currently being exhumed and documented by a general officer's review team, the figure who would eventually appear in marksmanship literature with his name finally attached, after decades of pseudonymous citation. She thought about the man who had sat on this shelf of rock with her when she was 17 years old and shown her how to read the wind like it was trying to tell her something, because he believed it was safe, and who had made her lie in the Montana grass for 2 hours without moving, because patience was not a personality trait but a skill, and who had told her with his last real warning, "Don't become me," that the greatest thing he could give her was his knowledge and the judgment to use it differently than he had. She had kept the promise imperfectly, human with mistakes. She'd recognized and corrected and carried. But she had kept it. She sat on the ridge for another hour. It moved. The river below caught it differently as the angle changed. She watched the valley the way he'd taught her to watch terrain, not focusing on any one thing, but keeping the whole field soft and open, letting the important details announce themselves rather than hunting for them. She was not the teenage girl who had arrived on this ridge with too much eagerness and not enough patience. She was also not the combat medic the SEALs had dismissed at the gate as a child playing soldier. She was not a weapon or a victim or a symbol. She was a woman who had come to a forward operating base with a rifle that didn't fit any form they had, who had made sound decisions in hard conditions, who had protected the people she was supposed to protect, including the 3 children, whose faces she still saw clearly when she closed her eyes, who had refused to become something she wasn't even when the pressure to do so came from every institutional direction at once. That was not a small thing. It had not been easy. It had cost her sleep and certainty, and the comfort of fitting cleanly into a category that other people could manage without having to think too hard. She would go back. She would finish the methodology documentation and give Elroy's team everything she had, and Thomas Voss's framework would enter the formal training system and save lives he never got to see and never needed to know about. She would continue to carry her medical kit and her rifle in the judgment to know which one the situation called for. She would work alongside men who had underestimated her, and then corrected the error, which was the only version of respect worth having, not the kind that arrives because of reputation, but the kind earned in real time by real decisions. She stood up from the shelf of rock. She took the bronze star out of her pocket one more time and looked at it in the mountain light. Then she put it away, picked up the jacket she'd set beside her, and started walking down the ridge toward the house, toward the truck, toward the work that was waiting. The valley spread wide and cold below her. The river moved through it the way rivers move through everything, not rushing, not pausing, just continuous, following the ground's own logic toward wherever it was going. Down. The greatest thing Thomas Voss had ever taught her wasn't the shot at 1,400 meters, or the wind layer calculation, or the way to read disturbed earth from a ridgeline. It was something simpler and harder, something that took her 3 years of training and 1 deployment and a week of institutional pressure to fully understand. Her that being underestimated is not a wound. Life is a position, and from the right position with patience and judgment and the skill to back both of them up, you can see exactly what's coming before anyone else does. And you can decide clearly, deliberately, with your eyes open what you do next.